All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I am AFJ Action Campaign President Rachel Rossi, and today's conversation is part of our ongoing series, Gavel In. This series features leading experts, activists, authors, scholars, judges, attorneys, all discussing current political and social justice issues. Our conversation today is paid for by AFJ Action Campaign and not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is an independent conversation. So today we're here to talk about one of the most important and often overlooked elections that is taking place in 2026, the Wisconsin Supreme Court election that is taking place April 7th, 2026, just 3 weeks away. And I know state Supreme Courts don't always make headlines the same way that presidential or congressional races do, but make no mistake, these races shape the laws that govern our daily lives. In Wisconsin, the Supreme Court has the final say on issues in the state, including defending reproductive freedom and labor protections, limiting partisan gerrymandering to protect voting rights, democracy, and core constitutional rights. And in recent years, Wisconsin's High Court has been at the center of nationally watched cases and record-breaking judicial elections. This Supreme Court has not only impacted Wisconsinites, did I say that right? Wisconsinites, yes, but all of us across the country. I'm thrilled to be joined today by three women with deep knowledge of the Wisconsin Supreme Court landscape who are going to break it all down for us. What's at stake in this upcoming election? So first joining us today is Stephanie Bloomingdale. Stephanie is the president of the Wisconsin State AFL-CIO. She is the state federation's first woman president, and she has over 30 years of experience in labor as an organizer, negotiator, trainer, and lobbyist. She leads one of the largest labor coalitions in the state and has long advocated for working families and strong civic participation across Wisconsin. In her electoral work, she has a statewide reputation for managing effective voter mobilization campaigns and holding elected officials accountable. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us today. And next, we have my wonderful colleague, Tish Gotell Faulks. Tish is our Senior Director for State and Local Advocacy at the Alliance for Justice Action Campaign. Tish works nationally to elevate the importance of state courts and to ensure that communities understand what's at stake in judicial elections. Tish is an attorney, an advocate, and an educator, passionate about motivating the United States to fulfill its promise of empowering the people to self-govern. Tish, we're so grateful to have you today. And last but certainly not least is Michelle Velasquez. Michelle is the Chief Strategy Officer for Planned Parenthood Advocates of Wisconsin. Michelle leads the organization's legal efforts to protect and expand abortion access. She has been a prominent voice in challenging Wisconsin's abortion restrictions in court and emphasizes that decisions regarding abortion should be made by patients and their doctors without arbitrary restrictions. Michelle, we are so happy to have you on the panel today. Thanks for joining us. So for our audience, later in the discussion, there will be an opportunity for you to ask our panelists questions. Please submit your questions in the comment box on the platform where you are watching, and feel free to submit your questions at any point during this discussion. Please note that AFJ Action staff members will be monitoring the comments, and any comments that are not in line with our mission or are discriminatory may be deleted. All right, let's get started. To first get us started, I'd love to talk just about the importance of elections for state Supreme Court justices. For many, when they think about elections, judges are not the first candidate that comes to their mind. In fact, I would say that many people may not even know that in many states, Supreme Court justices are elected, and that in some states, these elections are partisan, and in other states, they're nonpartisan. So Tish, I want to start with you. Can you just lay the groundwork for us? Why are state Supreme Court justices so important, and these races so important to focus on, especially now?
Thank you, Rachel. At this critical moment, the thing that folks on the ground are concerned about is government overreach. The idea that the government is no longer following the rule of law. State Supreme Courts have an opportunity, and indeed have taken that opportunity, to ensure that state constitutional law continues to protect folks, even though the federal system does not seem to be working for us.
That's well said, Tish. So turning us to talk a little bit about the specific race that we are here to discuss, the Wisconsin Supreme Court election on April 7th. I just want to start with each of our panelists. If you'll just briefly share with us, why does this race, this particular race, matter from your perspective? And Michelle, why don't we start with you?
All right, thanks for that. Great question. Where do I even begin as to why this race matters? But, just something that Tish said is, I think, so important, that as there's more federal overreach, and as we have seen the federal government and the federal courts erode the rights of people, the voting rights, the reproductive rights, we really are looking to our state courts to develop our state constitutional law and to make sure that the protections of our civil liberties, of our personal freedoms are really there and robust within our state. Particularly in Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Supreme Court plays a really critical role in shaping voting rights, education, workers' rights, all of those things. And this year is no different than the last few election cycles. The Wisconsin Supreme Court, the balance of the ideology is often at stake over the last few years. So just one justice can really tip the scale in either direction.
So true. And Stephanie, turning to you, why is this race so important?
Well, thank you. And thank you for having me here. And it really is terrific to be here with the Alliance for Justice, talking about our Wisconsin State Supreme Court race. And, here in Wisconsin, electorally, we think we're the center of the universe. Sometimes we are, sometimes we're not. But we are right now, where in 3 weeks, our voters are going to go to the polls to determine who is going to be our next Supreme Court justice. And we have a great candidate that we at the Wisconsin AFL-CIO have endorsed, Judge Chris Taylor. And she is a person that has stood up for working people her entire career, not only working with Planned Parenthood, but also working in the state legislature, and has a proven track record for really understanding the needs of union workers and working people, and being somebody that's very fair and very reasoned in her approaches. And so when Tish, you were talking about the overreach earlier, and I just can't think of anybody better than Judge Chris Taylor to be at our Supreme Court, to really be a thoughtful judge for us in Wisconsin. So we have this contest with Chris Taylor, who is our endorsed candidate, up against Maria Lazar, Judge Maria Lazar. And Maria Lazar, so that we all know who she is, she was someone who has a very deep track record of doing taking actions against working people. In fact, she worked with the Governor Scott Walker administration, and she really was his legal henchman of sorts. She was the person who defended Act 10, which, to remind all of us, was the union-busting bill that Scott Walker put into place in 2011 that took union rights away from our public sector workers in Wisconsin. So we have this real contrast between Judge Chris Taylor, our endorsed candidate, and Maria Lazar, who stands with Scott Walker, or did stand with Scott Walker against working people. So in terms of the issues that are coming up, do you want me to get into those now, or?
I'm going to come back to you on that, Stephanie, but
right.
that was a fantastic overview of the race, the candidates. I'll just pause and see, Tish, do you have anything to add just before we get into the nitty gritty? Why is this race in Wisconsin specifically so important?
Well, first and foremost, when people think about judges, they think about federal judges who are nominated and speak before the Senate, and then there's a confirmation. State court, specifically the Wisconsin State Supreme Court, the voters get an opportunity to have their voice heard in whose interpretation of the Constitution do they believe is meeting their best interests and the interests of the moment. At an opportunity to contribute to who is making those decisions, it's important for voters to get out. It is important for voters to go all the way down that ballot. And sometimes they have to flip it over to find the judicial election because these folks impact your everyday life with their decisions.
Very well said, Tish. And in a minute, we're going to dive into some of those specific types of cases, issues, constitutional interpretations that impact people. But before we do, I want to zero in on that point that a few of you just touched on, maybe starting with you, Stephanie, voter engagement on these types of races. So I know, Stephanie, under your leadership, that Wisconsin AFL-CIO has been very engaged in civic participation. Can you just tell us about the interest of voters in Wisconsin on state Supreme Court elections? Are you seeing public engagement? Are you seeing people getting out there, being interested in this race? What are you seeing on the ground?
Thank you, Rachel. And I think that you are absolutely right. And Tish really talked about this, that there's not always a deep understanding of the public of what happens in the Supreme Court. Like, how does the Supreme Court affect my life? And so we at the Wisconsin AFL-CIO do a lot of work to educate our members, our union members, on the decisions that are made at the Supreme Court. How do they directly affect our lives as union members? And so we have done that, and we have been working hard on this election. And of course, it's, you know, with this particular contest with Chris Taylor, who has, you know, had so much real effect on bettering union workers' lives versus Maria Lazar, the contrast is very apparent. And I'm just going to hold up a mail piece that we have that is going to be going out soon. So it's not out yet, but it really shows how Maria Lazar is, you know, right beside Scott Walker. And of course, Scott Walker was the, you know, we would consider him the most union, the anti-union governor in our history, whose sole mission was to bust unions and to make us all work for less. So in terms of that, really having people understand that Maria Lazar is, when those issues come to the Supreme Court, she's going to be thinking about corporate interests and not working people.
I really like the way that you framed that, Stephanie, because really that's exactly right. Once the public understands the positions of these candidates and how directly their rulings can impact workers' rights, union laws, that hopefully gets people more engaged. Michelle, I want to turn to you quickly about one of the specific issues that is quite important for our federal courts, our state courts. Planned Parenthood Advocates of Wisconsin has long been working to protect and expand abortion access. And we all know that the Supreme Court overruled Dobbs. Can you talk to us a little bit about why state Supreme Courts are even more important in this moment? And what are the implications of this race when we're talking about protecting reproductive justice and reproductive rights?
Absolutely. The Dobbs decision overturned that federal constitutional backstop, which means that every single state has a decision to make for itself. And that's whether it's through the legislature or the courts or a combination as to whether or not reproductive freedom and the decision whether or not to become a parent is protected under that state law or if it's restricted under that state's law. And it's really important that people in Wisconsin understand the Wisconsin law is still very tenuous in abortion rights, because right after Dobbs, Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin and the other independent provider had to stop providing abortions. And that is because there was a law on the books from the 19th century that was sort of up for debate as to whether or not it was still enforceable, which means a judge had to decide whether or not that law could be enforced by prosecutors around the state. Maria Lazar would have upheld that law. She thought that law could still be enforced. She has said that. Luckily, our state Supreme Court had the final word on that last summer and said, no, that law is no longer valid. Newer laws have taken its place. But these are the sort of decisions that Supreme Court justices are going to be faced with, interpreting the law. And while that law is no longer in force, there isn't a law on the books that protects abortion, and there has been no discussion yet as to whether or not our state constitution provides or protects a right to abortion access in this state. So these are the real issues that will very likely continue to make their way up to the state Supreme Court. Again, with that federal backstop of Roe gone, now our state Supreme Court justices must interpret our state constitution and the laws that legislators pass over the course of time and determine whether or not those laws violate our constitution, whether or not our state is one that protects people's ability to make those decisions about their lives and their futures for themselves, or whether our state is one that restricts those decisions or puts those decisions in the hands of the state legislature. Again, Maria Lazar has been very clear about where she stands on that when she worked for the Attorney General's office under then Governor Scott Walker. She worked to try to uphold state restrictions, try to uphold laws that made it more challenging for people to access abortion, access that healthcare when they need it.
So we talked a little bit about workers' rights that may be implicated when we look at the records of these candidates. We talked about reproductive justice and how critical it is that is at stake. Are there other areas that any of our panelists, if you want to jump in, what are some of the other areas as we're thinking about how to make sure that voters are engaged and that they understand the real broad impact of this state Supreme Court? Voting rights, other areas where you just want to highlight that voters should be paying attention to?
Rachel, it's critically important that people understand that state courts were the ones that stepped in and determined whether or not certain ballots were going to be counted consistent with state law and the expectations of Wisconsinites. Indeed, in several jurisdictions, we saw the court really stand its ground to ensure that these false electors were held accountable for the acts that they attempted to commit in flipping an election. We also have to keep in mind that when it comes to questions like redistricting, whether or not the polls have to stay open past closing time for legitimate purposes, and whether or not those purposes are in fact legitimate, all of those questions may end up before this court. And what's critical is to have someone in place who recognizes the need to empower the voice of the people. And Chris Taylor has experience in legislative work. She has experience in advocating for reproductive health and access, not just abortion, but the broader landscape of reproductive health concerns that Planned Parenthood typically tends to for folks in urban areas, in rural areas. The state Supreme Court may have a say in whether or not your ballot is counted, whether or not your school districts get the money that it needs in the time that it needs, and whether or not everyone will have an opportunity to cast their ballot if they are qualified voters.
I definitely agree with you there, Tish, that democracy is also on the line. And when we're thinking about the Supreme Court, it's just so critically important that voters understand what's at stake. And so we did talk about those labor rights, and I'm just so appreciative of the Alliance for Justice for putting together a program like this so that we can do a deep dive into it. And a special shout out to Carol and Bob, who asked me to be on here, and she now is working very hard at the Alliance for Justice, so thank her for that. And when we're thinking about this election, which is why it's so important for us at the Wisconsin AFL-CIO to do this robust reaching out to our members in this election. So we are going door to door of union members, talking to union members about the importance of the race, union members talking to union members in the workplace. We're using all means of communication, whether that be mail or social media. And really the best way for us is having those conversations one-on-one in the workplace. So that outreach is so important for us, because Wisconsin is really razor thin in terms of elections. And Tish talked about what else is at stake in the Supreme Court, and talked about the gerrymandering that we are seeing at the congressional level. So let me just say that Wisconsin, we are kind of like a 50-50 state. We're razor thin. We are always in the battleground. We'd like not to be in the battleground, but we are always in the battleground. And we win or lose elections by with less than 1/10%. So it's very critical that we do everything that we can to educate voters on how these races impact them. But it's also, when we're thinking about fairness in our democracy. Right now, we have this 50-50 state. We have 8 congressional members, 8, but we only have 2 Democrats. So we have what people like to call the ultimate packed and cracked system. So our 2 Democratic congressional people have very, I don't know the number, but like very big Democratic voter base, and the rest of the state is represented by Republicans in office. Now, anybody that's looking at a 50-50 state, our congressional representatives should reflect that. So there is a case, and you guys might have more of the nitty-gritty issues or technical parts of this case, but either next year or very soon in the future, our Supreme Court is going to be determining the constitutionality of those gerrymandered congressional districts. So that is very important that we have someone like Judge Chris Taylor who can have a balanced approach to this decision there. And on that same kind of issue in the integrity of elections, we're very worried about the future of elections in the whole country and, of course, Wisconsin. And we saw what happened in 2020. We saw what happened. They actually, Trump actually tried to get that election overturned. And they went to the Supreme Court. And thankfully, one of the traditionally conservative members, Brian Hagedorn, said, wait a minute, this is a bridge too far. I can't vote for this. And he voted the correct way, which was to maintain the integrity of our vote. So, but when we're looking to 2028, we need to make sure that we have people on that Supreme Court that are going to understand the value of democracy in our society.
So well said, Stephanie. And just kind of getting a little more sharper focused on the two candidates in this race. Michelle, Stephanie, each of you have talked a little bit about their backgrounds, but want to open up the floor to talk a little bit more about why each of these candidates, Chris Taylor, is such an outstanding candidate, and why we have such serious concerns about Judge Maria Lazar as a potential candidate. So I'll just open it up. Stephanie, Michelle, Tish, feel free to jump in if there are other specifics just to highlight for our audience.
I'll start with the most important factor according to AFJ's mission. Our goal is to ensure that demographically and professionally diverse attorneys have an opportunity to serve on state Supreme Courts. Typically, you are looking at someone who has worked in a large firm that typically represents Fortune 500 or Fortune 100 companies. You don't often see state Supreme Court jurists who have been public defenders, who have been tenants' rights attorneys, who has served in a capacity that improves the lives of everyday people. Chris Taylor is a movement attorney who is seeking to be on the state Supreme Court. Aside from the years of service that she had in the legislature, a particular category that makes her sensitive to the hard work that the legislature puts in. She was also the public policy director for Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin. So she is intimately familiar, not just with the hot button national concern about abortion, but she has experience working on behalf of the people impacted by whether or not abortion is accessible. And because she is a movement attorney and working in a field that AFJ has targeted, we support that candidate, Chris Taylor.
Thank you, Tish. And I think you meant AFJ Action. And yes, that is a really, I think, helpful way of depicting for our audience how we think about who should be on the courts when we think about movement lawyers. Michelle, Stephanie, if you have more to add, please jump in.
Sure, I'm happy to. Chris Taylor has the experience. Having been in the legislature, she knows how policies impact and shape people's lives. Her work has been really to expand access to healthcare, expand protections for people's civil liberties, for their right to access abortion, for their right to access reproductive healthcare, sort of the broader category of reproductive healthcare, not just abortion. And that's really important because we see nationally, some states are really trying to restrict access, not just to abortion, but to other forms of reproductive health care. We see a shrinking of investment in public health. So all of these things really impact people's day-to-day lives. And I think that, Chris Taylor is very smart, very independent. She knows, again, how these policies impact people, and she knows how her decision-making in a court also impacts people, right? So there's often this sort of misconception, I think, that judges are just sort of interpreting a law and as if everything's super clear. No, they're not making policies and laws the way legislators do, but their decision-making and the framework in which they're operating to make those decisions absolutely has policy implications. And so she really knows how that decision-making will impact people further down the road after that, that judgment or opinion comes out. There's this sort of, a lot of people say, well, Maria Lazar, for example, might say, well, it would be judicial activism to find a constitutional right to abortion in the state constitution, because that's not what the text says. But judges interpret the Constitution all the time. That's what their job is. They interpret the actions of a state legislature when that state legislature is passing laws and policy. And it was absolutely judicial activism that undid nearly 50 years of precedent in the overturning of Roe versus Wade. So I very much so question a candidate like Maria Lazar who believes that the overturning of Roe was a good outcome, of the right decision, when judges are supposed to be bound by precedent, and when there's nearly 50 years of law saying there is this constitutional right, this fundamental liberty to access abortion, overturned, that very much to me calls her abilities into question.
Michelle said it really well, talking about our endorsed candidate, our Wisconsin AFL-CIO endorsed candidate, Chris Taylor. And really in this race, there couldn't be a more stark difference between the two candidates. I mean, Chris Taylor is someone that I have personally known and worked with for a very long time. And she is someone who is very thoughtful, very smart, very strategic in her thinking about not only the issues that have come up in the past that may come to her in front of her as a Supreme Court justice, such as the congressional gerrymandering or integrity of elections, and legislative maps, but also, what are the issues that are on the horizon? Like, how is this new economy where gig workers are becoming what companies want to see us do versus being employees with the same rights that we have worked for so long. So Chris Taylor, with her work on the legislature, just has been somebody who has been thoughtful, strategic, smart, and has incredible integrity that is why our members trust her to be the decision maker at the Supreme Court.
Thank you all for those really helpful outlines of the two candidates who couldn't appear to be any more different. So I do want to zoom out for a moment because you've sort of hinted at it a little bit, but Wisconsin is a very important state. We've also seen how Wisconsin's become a national focal point for judicial elections. Does anyone want to jump in and talk about that? Some of our listeners today may not be Wisconsinites, many of them are, but just as others are thinking about, why should I pay attention to the Wisconsin State Supreme Court race? Anyone want to speak to that?
Sure, I'll take a try at that. So, I think that it's been mentioned a couple of times that Wisconsin the margins of victory here are razor thin, and we're just such a sort of 50-50 state. We're a swing state. And I think that the overarching sort of democracy protections here have real implications on the national level, particularly when we are talking about the maps in this state, the congressional maps in this state. So as it's been mentioned, there are 2 Democrats congressional members, and then the other 6 are Republicans, even though we have a divided state. And so I think as we are looking at our federal races, as well as like where the state goes, can often also be sort of a measure of where national politics might be headed as well. I think all of those sort of things combined really make Wisconsin such a focal point when it comes to our races, including our judicial elections. We saw last year's judicial election with Justice Crawford and the candidate Brad Schimmel draw huge national attention. A lot of money was brought into the state for that race, and that race involved really the balance of the court as well. And those are the people who are making those final decisions on whether or not people can cast their votes, how they can cast their votes, whether those ballots are counted, what those maps look like, whether or not people have reproductive freedom in this state. And so I think those are the sort of issues that are really drawing that national audience. Justices in Wisconsin sit on that court for 10 years. It's a really long time to make decisions that really can impact folks for generations to come.
Yeah, I mean, in Wisconsin, we we are in the spotlight a lot when it comes to electoral matches, and again with the Supreme Court. We'd rather not be, but we often are. And really thinking about, nationally, people are looking at Wisconsin's Supreme Court race, and of course, they were last year when we were able to win that election. Judge Susan Crawford won that election. And you all might remember Elon Musk put a lot of money into that race. You guys probably know the exact amount. I think it was like something about $25 million, the most expensive Supreme Court race in the country's history was last year. He was convinced, and Trump was convinced they were going to win. And so convinced, you had Elon Musk jumping around on stage with a cheese head and giving out $1 million checks to people. And I'm not even kidding about that. Giving out $1 million checks to people to influence them to vote his way. And so we saw that. And so now, in terms of when the topic is, why is Wisconsin in the spotlight? So it's because of this, but also a really important issue that many of your listeners will remember back in 2011 when Scott Walker did his Act 10, which was to take away union rights from public sector workers. And this was the biggest union busting that had taken place in our country. And we saw people from all across the country and all across the world really saying, really, no governor, no politician has the right to take away union rights from workers. And we had a massive education campaign on that. And that issue is going to be up in the next year in the Supreme Court. And so your listeners are going to say, we've been following this since 2011 to see what happened. And that is finally going to make its way to the Supreme Court for them to finally be able to rule on the constitutionality of taking away these union rights for public sector workers. So that is on the horizon with Act 10. And so we're seeing a lot of issues come to bear that are of national importance.
Rachel, I will say that the reason that AFJ Action has prioritized Wisconsin, made it one of our priority states, is because Wisconsin is a bellwether of what's coming to the rest of the country. It's no accident that Scott Walker seeks to take away unionization rights of public workers, and then Donald J. Trump attempts to do the same thing. Wisconsin is a place where ultra-conservative ideas were tested under Scott Walker. What we have seen grow out of that, however, is what's most important for our members and partners, despite what the political system looked like in 2011. There was the push to improve the government, the courts, and the way that policy was being decided. Between now and 2030, Wisconsin is going to have an election almost every year. Next year, there's an opportunity to pick up a seat currently held by a conservative jurist. The year after, there is an opportunity to pick up another seat currently held by a conservative jurist. And then finally, in 2028, we will have one of the movement-aligned jurists defending for that seat. With a court of only 7 people, by this time in 3 years, we may have a completely different court. The question that the voters have to consider, are we moving forward or are we continuing to allow federal policy to pull us back?
Very well said, Tish. And Stephanie, as I think about the picture that you painted for us of Elon Musk, I guess that's one of these downsides to being in the spotlight. And so, just curious, for Stephanie and Michelle, as you're working to cut through that, you've had a story of victory coming out of that outside billionaire influence attempt. How do you cut through it? How do you get to the voters? How do you do what you can when there's this outside spending and focus seeking to influence these elections?
Well, yeah, I guess I didn't hit the end of the story there, but we did win that race with Elon Musk, and we say we kicked Elon Musk's butt here in Wisconsin last year, so we were pretty happy about that because we won by 10 points. Now that doesn't mean that we are gonna that we are gonna rest on our laurels because of that, but we were happy that people really got the message and turned out to vote. Really, it's all about connecting these issues with working people and with our voters. One of the other issues that was brought up in the Supreme Court was this issue of legislative maps. So we talked about congressional maps, but there's also the state Senate and state assembly. And those maps were very, very much gerrymandered. Because of our Supreme Court decision, we were able to get new, more fair maps for Wisconsin. And so without their decision, we wouldn't be in this position to be able to have these more fair maps. And because of that, we have the opportunity this year to actually elect a working people legislature, both in the Assembly and the Senate and the governor, in which we would have a trifecta, and we would be able to move forward with what we really need to do, which is to reverse many of the things that Scott Walker did to working people. So what we're expecting to do is to reverse the so-called right to work for less, to completely eliminate and reverse the Union Busting Act 10, to reinstate prevailing wages, and to reinstate the ability to have project labor agreements. So our agenda is not only to, is to reverse what the damage that was done under Scott Walker, but always to move the opportunities for working people forward.
So, I think, your question was about how do we cut through, because we've got all this national money, and it's challenging right now because every single day there is so much sort of news coming out of the federal government and everything else going on in the world that it certainly is challenging. But I think what helps us at Planned Parenthood Advocates of Wisconsin cut through that is the relationships that we have with people, with communities. We are committed to year-round organizing at Planned Parenthood Advocates of Wisconsin. So we are engaging people in connecting the dots between the care they need, the access to the health care they need, the access to birth control, whatever it is that they need. We are helping connect that dot between that and the policy, and then the policymaker, the decider, who is ultimately making decisions about what healthcare access looks like, who is going to make decisions about the availability of healthcare for transgender folks on our state Medicaid plan. These are the sorts of things that we are working all year round to help people connect the dots and emphasize the importance of making their voice heard about what type of people they want making those decisions that impact, again, their daily lives. So it is not sort of a fly in at election time and say, this is the pro sexual and reproductive healthcare candidate that we are choosing. It is civic engagement and education on these issues, and receiving feedback from community and advocating during legislative sessions and advocating in the courts. Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin filed a lawsuit a couple of years ago, arguing that our state constitution, in fact, does protect abortion. That case was dismissed because it was sort of just moot after a different decision. But those are the sorts of advocacy work, going on year round here to break through some of that noise. And we know that people in Wisconsin overwhelmingly support access to abortion. We know they support reproductive freedom. And so helping bring them along in which candidates support their values is how I think we cut through some of that outside noise from folks like Elon Musk.
Love that. And thank you for that work, Michelle and Stephanie. Just hearing the work that you've been leading, it's very inspiring, I know, for many. We have some time for a couple of audience questions, and then we'll come back and just sort of close things out with what you all think our viewers should do. How can they get engaged? First question, how can I monitor current events around my state Supreme Court or decisions coming out of my state Supreme Court? If any of our speakers want to take that one. Tish, maybe you're the best one for that. Not to put you on the spot.
Oh, not at all. If someone is looking for understandable and easily digestible information about the work of state Supreme Courts, AFJ Action and its partner AFJ work in tandem to ensure that lay people who don't have a law degree, can find this information broken down in easy tidbits. Our website provides information about how many jurists are on your court, what the partisan breakdown is, when they're up for election. To the extent that you are interested in all of the reproductive rights cases that were considered by the court in 2017, we are developing a database that will launch soon that would allow you to search for those specific cases. And of course, when we are doing our State of Justice newsletter, we are providing insights to people in real time as to what's going on with the courts for the moment. To the extent that someone is watching a particular case, if it's high profile and important, AFJ Action is likely watching it as well.
Love that. Thank you, Tish. And we have another question for both Michelle and Stephanie. Can you share some stories that you have heard from voters in this election cycle? And have you heard from voters why this election is important to them? I know you sort of touched on this a little bit in your year-round advocacy, Michelle, so feel free to take it there as well. But our viewers just is curious to know, what are you hearing from voters?
So I think one of the things we're hearing most is that abortion is still a really important issue for people. And then sort of zooming out from that, healthcare access is another just critical issue for folks. So, and people are starting to equate healthcare access to abortion access and wanting politicians out of their business of all of the above. And so people are motivated on this issue very much across the state still. It is, it's about the healthcare access, but I think it's about even more than that. It's about people feeling like I get to decide what my life is. I get to decide whether or not I want to have children, when I want to have those children. And that's just so, I just think fundamental to to autonomy and to democracy, to have these really core rights. And so that is what we are hearing, that this is still very much a central focus for a lot of folks, even though there's a lot of other things happening in the world around them, when they get into the voting booth, that is still an issue that is top of mind when they are making their decisions about who to vote for.
And yes, the talking to union members and voters and in this time coming up to the election, people are really concerned about, what is their democracy going to be like? What is their life going to be like? What is their work life going to be like? And to connect those issues with the Supreme Court is just very important. Now, I talked before about, the decisions that have happened on the court. There's another emerging issue that I did want to mention, and that was a case of that the Supreme Court did take up, and it was Amazon Flex. And Amazon Flex is, it's like the people that deliver for Amazon. So Amazon Flex decided that these people were not their employees, they were independent contractors. So that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. It went to the Labor Industrial Review Commission, and then it was appealed, and it went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled in favor of working people. And what they said was, just because the multinational corporation says you're an independent contractor doesn't make it so. They ruled that these people are indeed employees, and employees that have the rights to unemployment insurance, worker comp insurance, fair labor standards, that have the same rights that all employees do have. So this issue of gig workers, we can see, is going to continue to be an issue in the courts. And that is an important issue that we're focusing on as well.
So important. Well, thank you, Michelle and Stephanie and Tish. Thank you for making it quite clear how the impact of this election is potentially so widely going to be felt by residents, both in Wisconsin and nationally. So last question for our panelists. What do we do about it? How can organizations, everyday voters, people who are just tuning in and learning about this, what can they do to help? What can they do to prepare for April 7th and support the work that each of you are doing in the state? I'll start with you, Stephanie.
Well, here at the Wisconsin AFL-CIO, again, we have a big program right now. So if people would like to volunteer, we'd be happy to have people volunteer to talk with working people about the importance of this race. We are doing door-to-door canvases. We're having people talk with each other in the workplaces, the good old-fashioned phone calls, and we are also doing just every way that we can reach people, either through digital, through the mail, through having conversations about these elections. And I think that it is just so important that these kind of discussions are had at our kitchen tables. We're talking about, the price of the groceries, and we're talking about the price of energy. We're talking about how the difficulties that we're facing in our lives. And, it's important that people have the information that they need to then take that next step and talk about how to fix those problems that we're facing. And to make it, Tish talked about having that information so that we can follow what's going on in the courts, because it does seem a little bit overwhelming and kind of, not really accessible. So it's important that we help people to make it accessible and make it an everyday, normal conversation to talk about what's happening in our courts. And then, of course, to get out and vote on April 7th.
Yeah, absolutely. Same with Planned Parenthood. Advocates of Wisconsin, folks can absolutely get involved. We do canvases and phone banking and text messaging. So we are always welcoming people to come out and canvass with us. And beyond that, I think it's those conversations and talking to the people in your networks, about who you're voting for and why. Why do you support Chris Taylor? What's important for you? What do you know about this candidate and where this candidate stands on the issues that are important to you and your loved ones? Where do they stand on regulating businesses who pollute the environment? Where do they stand on workers' rights? Where do they stand on reproductive healthcare access and rights? And where do they stand on education and the sort of investments that need to be made? Because those are all potentially decisions that the Supreme Court will make, right? They'll make decisions about fair maps, about voting, all of these things. Fair maps and voting will lead to who you are able to elect and vote for and who's going to potentially represent you in our state legislature making all of these other decisions. And so it can absolutely feel overwhelming. But I think that those one-on-one trusted conversations are really, really impactful. So I would encourage folks to have conversations about why they're voting and why it's important with their loved ones.
AFJ Action, because Wisconsin is a target state, has information up on its website concerning this specific race. We also have a lot of information on the website for people who are curious and want to compare Wisconsin to another state. AFJ Action will also be pushing out text messages leading up to and on election day. What is critical here, if you are an attorney, research strongly suggests that people who are not lawyers talk to and somewhat rely on the insights of their lawyer friends. If you are an organization, I certainly think that coming to our website will give you ideas. And of course, the state courts department is always interested in partnering with folks who want to start doing this work if they aren't already. And finally, for the voters, turn out, go all the way down that ballot. If you don't see the judicial race, flip it over and keep looking. It is critical that you include this as one of your top priority elections.
Thank you, Tish. And thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Stephanie. This has been such an informative conversation today. And I just want to take a minute to thank you all for your leadership, for all that you do in your organizations to protect and fight for the rights of residents in Wisconsin and nationally. It is so important, and we are grateful that you are in this fight. Thank you again for discussing with us today this upcoming state Supreme Court election on April 7th. You heard it here, everyone. Please make sure you are showing up to vote. And for our viewers to stay plugged in to the important work of our panelists, please check out their websites for more information. We also hope that you will follow AFJ Action on social media to stay up to date on future events like this. Thank you all for tuning in today. Again, this event was paid for by AFJ Action and not authorized by any candidate or any candidates committee. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.